The room goes completely still. Not the polite quiet of a ceremony, not the held breath before applause. A different kind of still, the kind that happens when something unexpected cuts through every layer of pretense in a room and leaves people without a script to follow. I am standing near the back wall of the Hargrove County Veterans Affairs Auditorium, and I am watching a man in a uniform I cannot fully read stand at the front of the room, facing my brother Daniel, who has not moved. The uniformed man says, in a voice that carries without effort, "I know exactly who paid that bill." And so does everyone in this room who served beside him. My brother's face does something I have never seen it do before. And I still cannot name what it is. Did I need to take you back about 14 months before that auditorium? My name is Marcus Webb. I grew up in a house in rural North Carolina where the rules were invisible but absolute, and the man who enforced them was my older brother Daniel Webb, not through volume or force, but through the quiet, steady application of authority that comes from being the firstborn son of a family that prizes certainty above everything else. Our father, Raymond Webb, died when I was 11 and Daniel was 19. By the time I was old enough to understand what that meant, Daniel had already rewritten the family's emotional ledger in his own handwriting. He was the decision maker. He was the one who handled the finances when our mother, Carol Webb, grew too tired to manage them herself. He was the one whose opinion determined whether something was worth discussing or worth dismissing. That I did not hate my brother.
I want to be honest about that.
What I felt was closer to a slow, grinding erasure, the kind you do not notice until you look back and realize entire chapters of your own life were lived in someone else's shadow, not because they were taller, but because they were simply more certain of their right to stand in the light. Our mother passed away in the spring of 2 years ago. She left the house to both of us equally. What followed was not a legal dispute, not exactly. It was a series of small maneuvers, each one reasonable sounding on its own, that collectively moved Daniel into the position of sole decision-maker about a property that was half mine. He scheduled meetings I was not told about. He contacted her estate attorney before I knew there was one. He forwarded documents for my signature in ways that framed my choice as ceremonial. I signed most of them, not because I agreed, but because I did not fully understand what I was agreeing to, and by the time I did, the shape of things had already been set. The summer after my mother died, I was eating alone at a diner called Patton's on Route 11 just outside Kinston. It was a Tuesday in August. The air conditioning was working too hard and losing. The vinyl booth seat under me was warm and cracked along the seam, and the smell of coffee and fried eggs had been absorbed so deeply into the walls that I do not think fresh paint could ever fully cover it. I was not in a good place emotionally. I had just come from another phone call with Daniel that had ended with him saying, in that measured, final tone he uses, "Marcus, you need to trust that I know what I'm doing with this." I had sat in the parking lot for 12 minutes before going inside. There was an older man sitting 2 booths ahead of me. He had a veteran's cap, dark navy blue, worn soft at the brim, and he was dressed plainly. A button-up shirt the color of old paper. Slacks that were pressed but thin at the knee. He had ordered, it looked like, coffee and a plate of toast. When the check came, I watched him reach into his jacket, pause, reach again, and then sit back with his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. The waitress, whose name tag said Bev, had moved on to another table. The man sat very still. He did not look around to see if anyone had noticed. That was the thing that stayed with me. He simply sat with whatever he was feeling, quietly, and his stillness had a kind of discipline to it that I recognized without being able to name. That I called Bev over and asked her to add his check to mine. I told her not to say who had done it. She looked at me for a second, then nodded, and went and said something to him anyway. She was that kind of person that he turned around slowly. He looked at me, without speaking for a moment. Then he said, "You didn't need to do that." I told him I know. I looked back down at my coffee. He didn't push further. That, too, was a kind of discipline that I finished my meal and left. I did not get his name. I did not think about it again for 3 days, until a card arrived at my home address, handwritten in ink so dark and deliberate it looked almost architectural. The gesture was noted. It is not forgotten. E. Calloway. I had no idea who E. Calloway was. I kept the card because the handwriting was beautiful. I put it in the desk drawer beside my mother's reading glasses, And I went back to the business of my grieving and my disputes, and I did not think about it again for another 2 weeks, until a man named Thomas Briggs knocked on my door. Thomas Briggs introduced himself as a Veterans Affairs liaison for Hargrove County, though I would later come to understand that his title understated his role considerably. He was a compact man, late 50s, with a particular kind of stillness in his hands that I have since come to associate with people who have spent years in rooms where the wrong movement carries consequences. He was carrying a manila folder that he did not open for the first 10 minutes of our conversation. He sat in my kitchen and accepted coffee and then said, "Mr. Webb, I'm going to ask you a strange question, and I need you to answer it honestly. Did you recently pay the diner bill for an elderly gentleman at a place called Patton's on Route 11? I told him I had. He set the folder on the table between us and pressed his hand flat against it, not opening it, just holding it there, and said, "Can I ask what made you do it?" I thought about Daniel's phone call. I thought about the 12 minutes in the parking lot. I said, "He looked like he needed someone to not make it a thing." Briggs looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "That's exactly the right way to describe it."
He did not open the folder that day.
He told me the man I had helped was named Edmund Calloway. He told me Edmund was 73, lived alone out past the edge of Kinston, and had been receiving VA disability assistance for about 4 years. He told me that Edmund's benefits had been placed under a payment review, a bureaucratic stall that sometimes takes months, and that Edmund had been navigating a period of financial restriction that, in Briggs's words, a man of his background should not have had to navigate alone. When I asked what background, Briggs paused in the way people pause when they're choosing their words deliberately and said, "That's something Edmund would need to share with you himself." I asked if Edmund knew he was here. Briggs said he did. He said Edmund had requested this meeting, that Edmund had, in fact, tracked down my address through a contact he did not name and asked Briggs to make initial contact on his behalf because, and this is a direct quote Briggs gave me that day, Edmund said he wanted to make sure he wasn't wasting your time before he took any more of it. That sentence stayed in my chest for days. He wanted to make sure he wasn't wasting your time. Quiet does not mean small. Briggs left the folder. He said I could look through it or not. He said Edmund would call in a few days either way. Did I open the folder after Briggs left, while the coffee was still warm? The first page was a standard VA intake form, the kind with boxes and codes. Edmund's full name was listed as General Edmund Robert Calloway, but the word General was printed there in the same font as everything else, without ceremony, in the box labeled former rank or title, and I read it the first time without it fully registering. Then I read it again, General. Not a courtesy title. Not an honorific passed out at local veteran dinners. The form listed his branch as U.S. Army, his years of service as 31, and the rank code beside his name, which I had to look up, indicated a 4-star general, the highest non-wartime rank in the United States Army, a rank held by fewer than 40 people at any given time in the entire history of the nation. That I sat with that for a while. I thought about the navy cap worn soft at the brim, the press slacks, the toast and coffee, the way he had looked at the table when the check came. He had not flinched. He had not looked around for help. He had simply sat with it. I thought about the card in my desk drawer, the dark, deliberate ink. The gesture was noted. It is not forgotten. That I closed the folder. I did not feel what I expected to feel, which I suppose would have been some kind of awe or excitement. What I felt was closer to a quiet kind of sorrow, the specific grief that comes from understanding that the world is not set up to recognize things correctly, that worth and visibility are almost never the same thing, and that sometimes the people who have given the most are also the most alone. On a Tuesday morning in a diner on Route 11. Edmund called 3 days later. His voice on the phone was what I would describe as considered, every word placed where it was meant to go, no wasted syllables, but not cold.
He thanked me again.
I told him the thanks wasn't necessary. He said, "Gratitude is always necessary. It's one of the things that keeps us honest." We talked for 40 minutes.
He did not tell me about his rank.
He told me about his late wife, Margaret, who had died 7 years before. He told me he had no children. He told me he had grown up about 12 miles from where I had grown up, which is how he had recognized the landscape around Patton's. He had eaten there himself 40 years ago, before it was Patton's, when it was called Hester's, and back then the coffee was worse and the eggs were better. He laughed when he said that. It was a quiet laugh that I asked him how he was doing, and I meant the VA process specifically, and he understood I meant that, and he said, "I've navigated more complicated terrain. The paperwork is just paperwork." What got to me that morning was not the money. It was sitting there and realizing I couldn't reach Margaret. He paused. She always handled the checking account.
I didn't say anything.
Sometimes that is the correct response. Before we hung up, he said, "I heard about your situation with the estate. Not the details, just that you're dealing with something difficult. If there's ever anything I can do, I want you to know the offer is real." I thanked him. I did not know at that moment what an offer from a man like Edmund Calloway actually meant that I was about to find out. The second time I visited Edmund in person was on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks later, and it was Edmund who introduced me to what became the first real turning point in my understanding of who he was. He lived in a modest ranch house set back from a gravel road, and the inside was clean in the way that military service permanently installs, not sterile, but organized, each object in its place not by compulsion but by habit, so deep it had become identity. There were bookshelves covering 2 walls of his living room. The books were a mix: history, philosophy, a few novels, field manuals so old their spines had gone the color of dried grass. On the mantel above the fireplace there were no medals displayed. There was one photograph, a group of men in uniform, desert dust on their boots, standing in what looked like the shadow of a building with no roof, and beside it a challenge coin, the kind passed between military personnel as tokens of service and respect, that was different from any I had ever seen. It was larger, heavier looking, darker in color. I asked about it. Edmund picked it up without hesitation, turned it over in his fingers once, and set it back down. He said only, "That was from a different kind of day." I did not push. He did not expand. But Briggs, when I asked him about the coin later, went very quiet and then said, "There are only 11 of those in existence. I'm not in a position to tell you what it represents, but I will tell you that the Secretary of Defense does not hand those out for administrative performance." 11. In the history of the entire United States Army, quiet does not mean small. The third discovery came not from Edmund or from Briggs, but from my own accidental persistence. I had started, quietly, to look into the estate dispute through a different lens, not just as a family conflict, but as a legal matter, and in doing so I had contacted a property attorney named Sandra Okonkwo, who practiced out of Raleigh, and who had been recommended to me by a colleague at the company where I worked. Sandra was precise, economical with words, and had a way of setting documents in front of you and waiting, without pressure, for you to reach the same conclusion she had already reached 5 minutes ago. She found, buried in the estate filing Daniel had submitted, a provision that had not been flagged in the summary documents I had been sent, a clause in the co-ownership agreement that, if allowed to stand, would grant Daniel the right of first refusal on any sale of the property, effectively making my equal ownership conditional on his approval. Sandra said, in her flat, factual tone, "This is legal. It is also, in my opinion, designed to give your brother structural control while maintaining the appearance of equal partnership." Asked what my options were. She said there were two: negotiate informally, which in her experience in situations like this usually resulted in the stronger party finding new ways to maintain structural control, or request a formal mediation or a legal review, which would require documentation, time, and the presence of someone with enough standing to make Daniel take the process seriously. I thought about Edmund's offer. The one he had said was real that I called him that evening and told him what I had found. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Does your attorney believe the clause was intentional?" I told him what Sandra had said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What does your gut tell you?" I said it told me Daniel had always known what he was doing. Edmund said, "Then we proceed accordingly." I didn't know what that meant yet. 3 weeks later, I did. Edmund arrived at Sandra's office for the estate mediation session with a man I had not met, who he introduced simply as Colonel Richard Hargrove, retired, United States Army, Judge Advocate General's Corps, meaning, as Sandra explained to me quietly while we waited, a military attorney of the highest rank, a man who had spent his career navigating the intersection of law and military command. Colonel Hargrove was tall, unhurried, and wore civilian clothes that somehow still looked like a uniform. He set a briefcase on Sandra's conference table, opened it without drama, and removed a stack of documents that were clearly not related to our estate case. Daniel arrived 10 minutes late with his own attorney, a man named Phil Carey who handled routine estate work out of Kinston, and who, I could see from across the table, immediately recognized that the room's gravity had shifted before the session even formally began. Edmund did not speak much in that first mediation session. He sat beside Colonel Hargrove as an observer. His stated role was that of a personal advisor, which is technically permissible in informal mediation, and he listened. But his presence in that room changed the temperature of it. I watched Phil Carey glance at Edmund 3 times in the first 10 minutes, each time with a particular careful expression of someone trying to place a face and failing. Daniel, to his credit, did not look rattled. He looked, as he always looked, certain. His certainty was a kind of armor, and it had served him for 40 years, and he was not going to remove it in a conference room. Colonel Hargrove spoke once, near the end of that first session, when Phil Carey referenced the co-ownership clause as a standard protection mechanism. Hargrove looked at the document, then at Phil Carey, and said, "Standard protection mechanisms are typically disclosed in the summary documentation. Can you show me where this clause appears in the summary Mr. Webb was provided?" The silence that followed was not dramatic. It was simply accurate. Phil Carey said he would need to review the documentation. Hargrove said, "Of course. We'll wait." We scheduled a second session for 2 weeks out. When Daniel and Phil Carey left, Daniel paused in the doorway, looked back at Edmund, still seated, still calm, and said nothing. He simply looked. Then he left at the parking lot. I asked Edmund what he thought would happen. He straightened his jacket collar and said, "The clause will be withdrawn, or it will be examined in a setting your brother will find considerably less comfortable." He paused. Then he added, "The point is not to punish him, Marcus. The point is to establish that the ledger is equal, because it always was." That was the first time he used my name directly. It felt, somehow, like something being handed back to me. The second mediation session did not happen. 2 days before it was scheduled, Phil Carey sent Sandra a letter withdrawing the co-ownership clause and proposing a straightforward equal partnership agreement. Sandra forwarded it to me with a one-line note that read, "They blinked." Edmund, when I told him, only said, "Good." But the story did not end there. Because in the interval between the 2 sessions, during those 2 weeks of waiting, something else had been set in motion that I had not anticipated and could not have predicted. Thomas Briggs had been working, quietly and without announcement, on Edmund's VA benefits review. He had submitted a request for priority reassessment, citing a clerical misclassification in Edmund's service record, a misclassification, Briggs told me, that had been present in the file for 4 years and that should have been flagged and corrected almost immediately, except that the person responsible for the initial review had been working from an incomplete personnel transfer that had not captured the full scope of Edmund's service record. The specifics were bureaucratic, the kind of tangle that happens when a man of high rank transitions out of service in a way that is not standard, and Edmund's transition, Briggs implied without fully stating, had not been standard. The reassessment triggered a formal review. The formal review required the involvement of the Veterans Affairs Regional Director for North Carolina, a man named Deputy Director Alan Forsyth, who had, according to Briggs, been in his position for 9 years and who handled reviews of this nature with what Briggs described as a professional's respect for accuracy. Forsyth requested a public acknowledgement session, a formal meeting of Veterans Affairs stakeholders in Hargrove County to address the service record correction and restore Edmund's full benefit eligibility. It was also, though no one called it this, a reckoning, because the session was to be held in the Hargrove County Veterans Affairs Auditorium, and it was open to the public. And Daniel, who sat on the county's Veterans Advisory Committee, a position he had taken largely for its social standing, was required to attend. The Hargrove County Veterans Affairs Auditorium seats about 200 people. On the morning of the acknowledgement session, it held perhaps 160. I arrived early. Edmund was already there, seated in the front row beside Briggs, wearing a dark suit with no medals, no insignia, nothing that announced him to anyone who did not already know. Daniel came in 20 minutes later and took a seat near the middle, beside two other committee members, his posture arranged in its customary configuration of composed confidence. Deputy Director Alan Forsyth, a man of perhaps 60, gray at the temples and precise in his movements, opened the session with a standard procedural statement. He outlined the circumstances of the record's correction. He described the nature of the clerical error. He used careful, neutral language that still managed to convey, to anyone listening closely, that the error had been significant and that its correction was overdue. Then he said, "I would like to take a moment to formally acknowledge the service record of General Edmund Robert Calloway, United States Army, retired." He read from a document. He did not rush it. He said that General Calloway had served 31 years. He said that Calloway had commanded at the highest operational levels. He said that Calloway had been the recipient of the Distinguished Service Medal, the Legion of Merit, and one decoration that Forsyth described only as a classified commendation, the existence of which has been cleared for public acknowledgement, the details of which remain under restricted access. 11 such commendations in history. Forsyth set the document down. Then he did something I had not seen before, and have not seen since he walked from the podium to the front row. He stood in front of Edmund. Edmund rose, slowly, and Forsyth rendered a formal salute, not perfunctory, not symbolic, but precise, held, deliberate. The room was completely still, Forsyth said. "On behalf of the Veterans Affairs Department of North Carolina, and on behalf of every person in this room who understands what this man's service cost him and what it meant, we see you, General. And we're sorry it took this long." Edmund returned the salute. Then he sat back down. He did not speak. Near the middle of the room, I watched my brother Daniel. His hands were in his lap. His posture had shifted, not collapsed, but something beneath it had loosened. Some load-bearing certainty had been quietly removed. Forsyth then turned to face the room and said, "I know exactly who paid that bill. And so does everyone in this room who served beside him." Daniel had been told why we were there. He had been told about the diner. He knew I had been the one who paid that bill. And now the entire room, including Deputy Director Forsyth, including Colonel Hargrove, including 160 people who had lived their whole lives inside the same county as this man they had never seen, they all knew it too, that I had never asked for that. I am glad it happened. We did not speak in the auditorium. After the session ended and people began to move, I stayed near the back wall while Edmund received acknowledgments from people who came to him one at a time, quietly, the way people approach something they have only just understood they are in the presence of. Daniel found me near the door. He did not say anything for a moment. He stood beside me, not facing me, but beside me, both of us looking at the room, and then he said, in a voice I had to lean toward to hear, "I didn't know." I said, "I know you didn't." He said, "About him, I mean. I didn't know who he was." I said, "I know." He went quiet again. I waited. He said, "I didn't know about you either." "Not," he stopped. He pressed his lips together. "Not the full picture." Those are not words Daniel Webb uses. I didn't know. In 40 years, I could count on one hand the number of times my brother had acknowledged an incomplete accounting of a situation. He did not say he was sorry. He did not offer a correction or a revision of his behavior. What he did was stand beside me and say, in a lowered voice, that his picture had been incomplete. For Daniel, that was enormous, I said. The agreement Sandra drew up, the equal partnership document. "I'd like us both to sign it this week." He said, "I'll have Phil send it over tomorrow." That was it. We did not embrace. We did not catalog the years. He moved toward the door first, and as he was going, he did something that I suspect he was not fully conscious of. He held the door open for me, stepped back, and waited. He had not done that in my memory.
It was a small thing. A door.
A step back. A pause that I too was the most honest thing he had done in years. Edmund found me in the parking lot afterward. He was carrying his jacket over one arm, the morning having grown warmer while we were inside. He shook my hand and then held it for a moment, the handshake of someone who means it, and said, "How do you feel?" I told him I wasn't sure yet. He nodded, as though that was exactly the right answer. He said, "That's how it usually feels when something real has happened. the feeling catches up later. I asked him if he would be all right. He looked at me with something that might have been amusement and said, "Marcus, I've been all right for a very long time. I just wasn't always seen." He picked up his jacket and folded it over his arm more precisely. "That's a different thing entirely." He walked to his car. A modest sedan, unremarkable in every way. He did not look back. I watched him drive away, and the parking lot was warm and quiet, and I stood in it for a while. Did I have thought about that Tuesday in August more times than I can count? The cracked vinyl seat, the too cold air conditioning losing its battle with the heat, the sound of Bev moving between tables. Did I have tried to understand what it was that made me reach out to pay that check? And I am honest enough with myself to know that it was not nobility. I was sitting in the residue of a painful phone call with my brother, feeling the specific small shame of having let someone else define the terms of my own life again, and across the aisle there was a man sitting with his own particular weight, holding it without performance, and something in the alignment of those two moments produced a single, wordless act. I asked Bev to add his check to mine. That is all it was. But here's what I have come to understand about quiet people. They carry things the rest of us put down, but we put them down because they are heavy, or because we are in a hurry, or because we have decided in the efficient, practical way that modern life rewards that there is no return on holding them. Gratitude, silence, dignity, patience. These are expensive things to carry. They do not make noise. They do not generate attention. They do not produce visible results in the short term. So we set them down. Quiet people do not set them down. They carry them for 31 years. They carry them through the loss of a spouse who managed the checking account. They carry them through a bureaucratic stall that would have broken a smaller spirit. They carry them to a diner on Route 11 and sit in a cracked vinyl booth and order toast and coffee and feel the weight of something small and specific, and they do not make it anyone else's problem. Quiet does not mean small. I think about my father, Raymond, who died when I was 11 and who, in the years since, has existed in my memory primarily as a silhouette, a shape of a man that other people filled in with their own interpretations, Daniel's chief among them. I wonder sometimes what Raymond was carrying that none of us thought to ask about. I wonder what weight he had absorbed on behalf of the family without announcement. I wonder how many people in our lives are Edmund Calloway, carrying the full weight of what they are without once asking us to acknowledge it, and quietly absorbing the indignity of being unread, unrecognized, sitting alone at a table with a check they cannot immediately cover, looking at the surface of things with a steadiness that took them 30 years to build. The world is full of these people. The world is not particularly good at seeing them, what I know now, not as a lesson I was taught, but as something I tripped over in the dark on a Tuesday in August, is that the act of paying attention to another person's quiet is not charity. It is not generosity in the traditional sense. It is closer to justice. It is the correction of a small imbalance in the way the world distributes its acknowledgement. Edmund did not need me to see him. He had been seen by people whose judgment carried the full weight of the United States Army behind it. He had been saluted by men who understood exactly what that cost and what it meant. What he needed on that Tuesday was simply not to be left with the discomfort alone. That is a different thing. And it costs almost nothing. I keep his card in my desk, beside my mother's reading glasses. The ink is still dark. The letters are still deliberate. I take it out sometimes, and I remember the auditorium, the room going still, Forsyth's salute, held with precision, and Edmund, sitting back down without a word, carrying it all as he always had. Some people contain multitudes. They never make you look.